Sahakyan received his PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Studies in 2015. He then held Armenian postdoc fellowship the following year, and this academic year he is a Manoogian visiting lecturer at the Department of Near Eastern Studies. Thank you, Professor Hagen, for providing a warm home for him in Near Eastern Studies. It goes without saying that Sahakyan is an active and valued member of our community. Sahakyan wrote his dissertation on the Armenian diaspora in Beirut and Paris, crossing the Atlantic to the East Coast cities of New York and Boston, all the way to the West Coast and Los Angeles. The result was a rich narrative that moved us through a myriad of networks and institutions, from church to schools to benevolent societies and clubs, complicating a singular notion of community and nation. He's currently turning his dissertation into a book entitled Constructing Belongings, Negotiating Identities. It's being negotiated, but you get the gist of it, in modern Armenian diaspora, where he analyzes the historical and social idiosyncrasies of the Armenian diaspora as a case study that allows him to critique the existing literature on diaspora, questioning reified concepts of singular identities, as well as discourses on homeland, ethnicity, and nation. His work departs from ethnically constructed paradigms, emphasizing instead the political and social context in which different forms of Armenianness were negotiated, experienced, or constructed as a set of religious, linguistic, and political sense of belonging. Sahakyan is carving a new space for the study of Armenian diasporas, bringing his subject into dialogue with transnationalism and other migratory experiences of Arabs and Jews in America at the turn of the century. By placing multiple Armenian diasporic experiences in a comparative and transnational frame, his work in progress highlights alternative processes of forging group belongings in and beyond the borders of empire and nation. Today he will be talking to us about these new directions of his research. Please join me in welcoming Vahe Sahakyan.
Thank you, Catherine, for this very generous introduction. I actually learned about my work much from your introduction. Thank you. I would like to start by thanking the Armenian Studies program for providing this wonderful opportunity to present my work in progress, as well as my Department of Near Eastern Studies for their support as well. And it is actually ironic, I find it a little ironic that I'm speaking about immigration in his historical period in this country when we don't really know where it will move in terms of immigration policies. But anyway, so my talk today is entitled Immigrants into Ethnic Americans, ethnic in quotation marks, negotiating race, language, religion, and belongings. In the 1870s, Isaac Meyer Weiss, a German Jewish immigrant rabbi from Bohemia, who became the most influential leader of the American Reform Judaism, wrote, I quote, "The Jews must be Americanized. The Jew must become an American in order to gain the proud self-consciousness of the freeborn man. We must not be only American citizens, but become Americans through and through outside of the synagogue. But if I succeed in Americanizing my co-religionists, will not Judaism disappear in Americanism? This must be counteracted by better knowledge of Jewish history and Jewish sources. A Jewish patriotism, pride in being a Jew, must be aroused." End of quote. About 30 years later, Diran Hovsepian, an Armenian immigrant from a small village in the Ottoman Empire, wrote in his private correspondence to a friend, I quote, "It is my ambition to remain a true Armenian and yet to become a good citizen of the United States. I love our language with the warm heart of an Armenian and I like to learn English for its own sake and as my first duty of citizenship. I shall henceforth write to you in English, and I want you to answer me in the same language. It will be good practice for both of us." End of quote. Such voices of prominent and less prominent immigrants have been silenced in popular at the time theories of melting pot, Anglo-conformity, and immigrant assimilation for decades, until sociologist Ruby Jo Kennedy reported in the American Journal of Sociology in 1944 about the triple melting pot with strong religious divides between Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. About 30 years later, in 1970, two other sociologists, Nathan Glazer and Daniel Moynihan, published a work entitled Beyond the Melting Pot, in which they argued that the melting pot did not happen. Studies of American immigration proliferating since the 1970s, including the works of Glazer and Moynihan, began emphasizing instead ethnic resilience, persistence. Some sociologists even argued for the emergence of new ethnic categories, ethnogenesis, or the invention of ethnicity in American context. The accounts I quoted above suggest that unlike the popular at the time discourses of assimilation, indeed some immigrants did not see their identities as inherently incompatible with Americanness. They did not perceive Americanization as a process in which they would have to abandon all their ethnic traditions and forget the past. The accounts rather suggest that the immigrants, or immigrant visionaries to be more precise, found it possible to become American and at the same time remain good Jews, Armenians, Italians, Irish, or other. My intention here is not to suggest that assimilation was not part of the immigrant experiences. Many immigrants voluntarily chose to Americanize by adopting American names, by abandoning traditional lifestyles, values, and norms, by learning English, by appearing as American as they could or imagined, often by converting to Protestantism and attending Protestant churches. But parallel to these stories of assimilation, in places where the immigrants formed compact communities, they could afford recreating their own organizations, institutions, periodical press, and re-establishing their traditional communal life and culture. In my talk today, I wish to pursue a triple goal by focusing on these collective immigrant experiences. First of all, I will complicate the stories and histories of assimilation by exploring alternative routes to Americanization between the 1890s and 1930s. Secondly, I will challenge the approaches of ethnic resilience which present the immigrant experiences as stories of becoming American while preserving their ethnic traditions. Finally, I will question the validity of the concept of invention of ethnicity in American context by arguing that these emergent hyphenated forms, such as Armenian American, Jewish American, Irish American, or other, are hybrid, representing a mix of Americanness and certain ethnic traits. Moving beyond the essentialized notions of ethnicity or ethnic identities, I will explore the dynamic process of identity negotiations and formation, which produce these mixed forms of hyphenated Americanness and which cannot be simply reduced to their ethnic and American components. In other words, I will argue that in these complex identities, it is impossible to clearly delineate the so-called ethnic and the American constituents. I propose using the term negotiation to argue that it is in the complex process of negotiations of race, language, religion, and belonging that the immigrant collectivities and their descendants eventually produce new forms of Americanness, which also contain certain constructed or reinvented or reshaped ethnic traits. In this process of negotiations, the immigrant collectivities expanded and changed the notion of Americanness as much as they changed and expanded their own immigrant identities. This approach contributes to the scholarship in which the immigrant collectivities are examined as active agents in the shaping of their identities and what I call certain spaces of difference and diversity in their countries of permanent settlement. In what follows, I will show how the immigrant collectivities and their descendants have managed to create such spaces, especially in the period when the American state policies created inhospitable environment and put much effort to Americanize, that is, to assimilate the immigrants and their descendants. First, I will propose a theoretical framework and define the concepts I use. Then I will proceed to bring some examples of immigrants' negotiations of race, language, religion, and belongings in American context, and how these produced new forms of Americanness. I am primarily relying on the collective experiences of the Armenian immigrants in the comparative perspective because I believe the Armenian case, alongside a few others, more comprehensively contains examples of negotiations in all levels that I'm interested in my talk, namely of race, language, religion, and belongings. Gender and social class are also important intersections in the immigrant negotiations of identities and belongings, but a comprehensive analysis of all the aspects of the immigrant negotiations falls beyond the scope of my current talk. I hope the framework I will develop in my talk may be useful to the studies of other cases of immigration, whether in the United States or other countries. Now let me proceed to presenting my theoretical framework. My talk and conclusions are based on the perspective which I have developed from my different positioning towards the problems of immigrant integration. Positioning matters in what we say or write, as Stuart Hall reminds us. Positioned as a diaspora historian who looks at different societies from global and transnational perspectives, one of the questions that I'm interested in is how and why transnational connections among the generations of dispersed populations become possible historically, especially in the age before the internet and advanced communications, such as the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In other words, I'm interested in understanding how dispersed immigrant populations in certain countries developed and maintained durable translocal and transnational networks which made it possible for their descendants, often offspring of mixed marriages, to stay connected transnationally and develop what is called a diasporic consciousness. I discuss all these matters in greater detail in my research in progress, but my intention today is to show how Armenian diasporic nodes emerged in America in the period between the 1890s and 1930s. Regarding Western societies in general, I posit that the basic principles of democratic constitutions, such as the separation of church and state, freedom of expression, press, assembly, and speech, have created the necessary preconditions for the emergence of spaces for the articulation and maintenance of difference, even if the founding fathers of Western democracies, authors of constitutions and amendments had not envisioned these consequences. I examined the case of France elsewhere, and here I will be focusing on America to argue that even at the time when the American state officials and public discourse at large promoted and valorized assimilation, the society still yielded spaces for the articulation, expression, and production of ethnic confessional spaces of difference. By spaces of difference, I'm not implying that the American state or society were generally homogeneous, and that such spaces should be necessarily juxtaposed against a culturally monolithic American background. Rather, by spaces of difference, I refer to institutional and discursive spaces created by immigrant collectivities and maintained by their descendants to preserve and perpetuate something perceived as belonging to a given community's past that is also perceived as not belonging to the local population as a whole, whether those perceptions were accurate or not. By closer look at the immigrant communities and collectivities, my research bears witness to the voices and experiences of the immigrants and their descendants in order to understand how, in the process of integrating into American society, they actively created new forms of belonging, new forms of Americanness. For this reason, I prefer using the concept of negotiations, which implies the existence of two or more agents, all of whom are actively involved in the subject matter of negotiations. Building on Stuart Hall's insights on cultural identities as a production, which are never complete and always in process, I argue that these negotiations begin with the settlement of the immigrants in host countries and may continue through their descendants if the first generation is successful enough to establish durable spaces in which they can articulate, recreate, refashion, or in their understanding, preserve and maintain their ethnic traditions. One of the necessary preconditions for the emergence of such spaces is the critical numbers of immigrants and the density of their concentration in certain areas and neighborhoods. Between the 1880s and 1920s, more than 18 million immigrants entered the United States, predominantly from Eastern and Southern Europe and the Middle East. In this period, many immigrant concentrations emerged abundantly in the industrial metropolitan centers of New York, New England, Midwest, as well as in the growing agricultural regions in California. Lower East Side in Manhattan hosted a large community of Eastern European Jews, allowing for the Yiddish language and culture to thrive for more than 30 years. Not too far from it, concentrations of immigrants from Italy, China, and Syria made these parts of Lower Manhattan known as Little Italy, Chinatown, or Little Syria. Armenian immigrants in Worcester, Massachusetts, and Fresno, California likewise settled in close neighborhoods, making those parts of the towns known as Little Armenias. Such close settings provided spaces in which the immigrant generation collectively engaged in negotiations of religion, language, and belonging. To simplify, or maybe complicate, I'm proposing the following framework. First generation of immigrants entered into a liminal space. This term, liminality, popularized by anthropologist Victor Turner and recently appropriated by scholars of transnational migration, encapsulates the various concepts that scholars of immigration have used to describe the experiences of in-betweenness, or not here, or multi-locality, and various passages from old to new, which may generate new institutional and discursive forms. Negotiations of religious, cultural, linguistic belongings and identities in general began in these liminal spaces and, to borrow from Mary Pratt, zones of contact among the various immigrant and American cultures. The success or failure of the initial stage of negotiations, I argue, may lead to three possible outcomes. Cultural assimilation is, of course, one of the major outcomes, which is the near complete loss of ethnic and traits and total acculturation into American society over a few generations. Here, however, I'm more interested in negotiations which result in the emergence of what I call institutional and discursive spaces of difference. By institutional spaces, I mean hometown societies, religious, cultural, philanthropic, or political organizations established by the immigrant generations. And by discursive spaces, I mean sites of cultural production emerging beyond the immediate immigrant neighborhoods and institutional spaces which create connection between immigrants in different localities and transnationally through the means of discursive forms such as various publications or periodical press. The second phase of negotiations begins in these established institutional and discursive spaces where the immigrant generation is challenged to connect their descendants to these ethnic by essence institutions, organizations, and spaces. In the second phase of negotiations, they have to rethink the compatibility of their ethnic traits with Americanness and find ways in which they and their descendants can be American and stay connected with the established institutional and discursive spaces. It is in the second phase of negotiations, I argue, that some old world traditions are abandoned, some are adjusted to American culture, some are revisited and reconstructed in the American context, resulting in the emergence of mixed, hybrid, or hyphenated representations and identities. The durability of these emergent institutional or discursive spaces depends on the success of the negotiations in the second phase. In the process of negotiating such ethno-confessional spaces of difference, various institutions may become embedded in the legal, political, and social structure of American society, thus turning into equally American spaces. By the mid-20th century, for example, Judaism and Catholicism and many other less prominent religious practices became as American as Protestantism. The Americanization of these immigrant collectivities within these immigrant spaces of difference, thus, I argue, involves simultaneous processes of selective inculturation or acquisition of the American culture and selective deculturation or retreat from some traditional identities which result in new hybrid and hyphenated forms of Americanness. Now let me move forward to discuss my examples of how these spaces of difference emerged between the 1890s and 1930s in the complex processes of negotiations of religion, race, language, and belongings among the Armenian immigrants and their descendants in America. Family and kinship ties and acquaintance networks have been instrumental in minimizing the risks associated with long-distance migration, as Charles Tilly reminds us in his seminal essay, Transplanted Networks. These networks promoted chain migration and resulted in the emergence of immigrant enclaves of various shapes and sizes in the growing industrial and agricultural centers of America. Early Armenian immigrants from the Ottoman Empire likewise created little Armenian enclaves, usually internally demarcated by hometown affiliations. Be it in Worcester, Massachusetts, Fresno, California, New York, or elsewhere, in places where the late 19th century Armenian immigrants numbered in hundreds or even thousands, the Armenian quarters represented concentrations of family and kinship groups from Kharbert, Bitlis, Yozgat, Musht, and many other small towns and villages of central and eastern Anatolia. This slide kind of gives that general impression. Internally diverse, yet they were Protestants or Apostolic Armenians by faith. Many were fluent in Armenian or Turkish and shared the same experiences of discrimination and exclusion in workplaces, evening schools, and the American society at large. Many scholars have emphasized the role of religion as an important site for practicing ethnicity. Therefore, I will refrain from making the same argument for the Armenians. Rather, I will focus in this section on the negotiations part, on how the Armenian places of worship and other organizations emerged, and how in the process of ongoing negotiations, they adjusted to American social milieu, becoming Armenian-American hybrid spaces. Before the founding of Armenian churches, first Armenian immigrants attended local Armenian American Protestant churches. Sometimes Protestant missionaries and Armenian preachers would hold prayer meetings at private homes or in rented facilities. Compared to the Jews or Muslims in America, the Protestant Armenians, and to a lesser extent, the Apostolic Armenians, could more easily adapt to the versions of American Protestantism. Witnessing such conditions upon his arrival to Worcester in 1888, Mkրտիչ Portugalyan, a prominent Ottoman Armenian educator and intellectual, stated in one of his speeches, I quote, "No matter how much Armenians are persecuted in Muslim countries, they can keep their nationality and their own church. But in Christian countries, especially in America, there are many more difficulties in preserving our national and religious identity. Wherever the Armenians have gone, they have also brought with them their Armenian churches, the Armenian press, the Armenian schools, and that national trinity has graced them with prosperity and has saved their national existence from all alienating forces and unfavorable circumstances." End of quote. Inspired by Portugalyan's speeches, the Apostolic Armenians in Worcester formed an Armenian academy for establishing an Armenian church. In their first few meetings, the newly formed organization voted unanimously to exclude the Protestant Armenians. The Academy addressed a letter appeal to the Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople with the request to send an Armenian Apostolic Vartapet to serve in Worcester. In response to the plea, Patriarch Khoren Ashigyan sent Bishop Hovsep Sahakyan to Worcester in 1889, who became the first Armenian Apostolic priest of America. Taking advantage of the First Amendment, in July 1890, the Academy applied for a permit to build an Armenian church in Worcester. The permit was granted on July 24, and 6 months later, on January 18, 1891, the First Armenian Apostolic Church of America, Surperkich, or Our Savior opened its doors to congregation. Inspired by Bishop Sahakyan's appointment and often with his initiative and support, many Armenian apostolic communities followed the suit. Armenian apostolic churches emerged in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island, Hartford, Connecticut, Fresno, and many other places. In 1898, the special decree of the Catholicos, or the Supreme Patriarch of the Armenian Church, Mqrdishq Ghirimian, organized the Armenian churches into a separate diocese with its prelacy seat in Worcester. Here is the overall hierarchy of the diocese. Bishop Sahakyan became the first primate of the Armenian Church and embarked on organizing parish councils across the country wherever apostolic Armenians constituted significant numbers. In this initial phase of negotiations, the apostolic Armenians created spaces in which they could freely exercise their freedom of conscience and equally retain the traditional religious services and practices imported from the Old World. The negotiations of religious belonging among Armenians elsewhere took different routes. In Fresno, for example, the pioneering Armenian immigrants attended First Congregational Church with Americans. Ostracized and discriminated in the American anti-immigrant political and social milieu, these church attendees, although many shared with their American co-religionists the basis of the Protestant faith, yet they were nevertheless forced to sit in less desirable portions of the church. In 1894, Mesrop Sinanyan, a bold Armenian immigrant, dared to take one of the front seats and was eventually forced out of the church. This incident escalated tensions between the Americans and Armenians and resulted in the expulsion of the entire Armenian congregation from the church. With the help of the Presbyterians, 3 years later, a group of evangelical Armenians were able to organize the Armenian First Presbyterian Church in Fresno in 1897. The building was constructed several years later, but there was an independent church. Another group of Protestant Armenians founded the Pilgrim Armenian Congregational Church in 1901. As the names of both of these churches indicate, Armenian became the most important marker and demarcator of these Protestant spaces from their similar American spaces. Yet in this period and context, I would argue, Armenian was racial rather than ethnic category. Now let me summarize what I've argued so far. In places where immigrants concentrate in relatively large numbers, they create or transplant a number of organizations and institutions. In this liminal space, these various collective initiatives bridge the old world with the new world, and at the same time, some of them help the immigrants to make the passage from the old to the new world. In other words, in the initial phase of negotiations, the immigrants create a number of organizations which help, on the one hand, transfer or transplant the old world customs and traditions to the new world and still remain connected to the old world. Their constitutional rights, freedom of assembly, press, religion, whether rationalized or not, serves these interests the best. Alongside churches, early Armenian immigrants created a number of other organizations ranging from small hometown societies to all Armenian initiatives, such as the Armenian political parties and the Armenian General Benevolent Union, and others. These organizations demarcated spaces of Armenianness from spaces of Americanness, which remained structurally and culturally separated in the first phase of negotiations. These two spaces, Armenian and American, had to eventually converge and mix and produce new hybrid forms as the immigrants continued reimagining and negotiating their identities and belonging in the new country. I will need to skip the details of how other Armenian institutional spaces emerged in America in the late 19th and early 20th century, but let me now mention some examples of what I call discursive spaces that emerged in this period as well. Various estimates put the number of Armenians in America between 80 and 100,000 by the 1920s. Alongside a number of societies and organizations, these immigrants also founded a number of journals and newspapers to address the needs of the Armenian immigrants across the country and often in order to advance certain political agendas. Like other immigrant periodicals, Armenian journals and newspapers emerging in this period were predominantly in Armenian language. Hayrenik in 1899 or Asparez in 1908, established by the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Zayn Hayrenyaz in 1899 or Yeridas Artayastan in 1903, founded by the Sahakyan party, created shared discourses among their respective audiences nationally, usually around the events happening in the homeland thousands of miles away. Following First World War, the Armenian genocide and the destruction of Armenian homelands, these and other Armenian periodicals became important agencies of redefining Armenianness in the American and transnational contexts. Other, more neutral newspapers, such as Kochnag, established in 1900 by Protestant Armenians, alongside addressing exclusively Armenian problems, helped the immigrants to Americanize by publishing articles and brochures on American Constitution, citizenship, culture, or the importance of learning English. These discursive spaces emerging in the immigrant liminal spaces connected the immigrants with the events happening beyond their immediate neighborhoods, thus creating certain imagined, to borrow from Anderson, perceptions of simultaneity among all Armenians nationally and transnationally, beyond the narrowly defined hometown affiliations and loyalties or beyond the institutional spaces. The first phase of negotiations thus resulted in the creation of a number of organizations and institutions, but as the immigrants crossed the threshold to exit the liminal space and enter the American space, they had to rethink and adjust their collective initiatives to become more compatible with the American realities. And this is what I'm going to address in the next part of my talk. The first formal step towards leaving the temporal liminal space and becoming permanently American was the process of acquiring citizenship through naturalization. Since the adoption of the Naturalization Act of 1790, federal citizenship in America was restricted to free white persons only. The Naturalization Act of 1870 extended the eligibility to aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent. Armenians, alongside many other immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe and the Middle East, were not an obvious fit either in the white or the African categories. William Ripley, professor of economics at MIT and racial theorist, defined Armenians in his 1896 study of races of Europe as belonging to the Armenoid race who resembled the, quote, Alpine races of Western Europe, unquote, but clearly had no connection to the white Anglo-Saxon European Nordics. Other ethnographers and scholars of eugenics categorized Armenians as Asiatics and some as Caucasians, but apparently this did not prevent Armenians from being admitted to citizenship, at least before 1909, when 4 Armenian petitioners were denied naturalization because they were not seen as white. Between 1878 and in 1952, American courts across the country examined 52 cases in which immigrants of different backgrounds negotiated their racial belongings for the purpose of naturalization. In his revealing study, White by Law, Yain Lopez makes a compelling case for what he calls the legal construction of race. He questions the boundaries of whiteness by providing an insightful examination of the prerequisite cases and contemporary white identity. I am interested in these prerequisite cases because they provide examples of negotiations of racial belongings through which the attempts of the immigrants to situate themselves in the racialized American legal system eventually extended the boundaries of whiteness beyond the more traditional Eurocentric perceptions. Of course, not all immigrants were successful in negotiating their racial belonging. Applicants from Hawaii, China, Japan, Burma, Korea, or the Philippines, as well as those of mixed races, failed in their negotiations because of the prevailing discrimination and exclusionary legislation adopted by Congress, particularly against the Chinese and Asiatic immigrants. Mexicans and Armenians were more successful in their negotiations, while for the immigrants from Syria or India, for example, courts arrived to contradictory conclusions. By reading some excerpts from the case of 4 Armenian petitioners, my intention is to show how the meaning of whiteness was debated and negotiated and eventually expanded to include the Armenians. In 1909, 4 Armenians from various parts of the Ottoman Empire appealed to the Circuit Court of the District of Massachusetts to examine the denial of their naturalization applications upon the ground that they were not free white persons. 3 of them, HALLADJIAN, Ekmakjan, and Muradjan, were born in what the court records described as, quote, the Asiatic part, unquote, of the Ottoman Empire, Aintab, Diyarbakir, and Adana, respectively. And the 4th petitioner, Bayans, was born in the suburb of Constantinople, quote, on the west side of the Bosphorus, unquote, as the court records again clarified. Based on the analysis of scientific evidence and congressional intent and using common sense elsewhere, the judge ruled that they were all white and duly qualified for citizenship. In the course of the proceedings, the judge called into question the presumed connections between European and white races and Asiatic and yellow races. He particularly reasoned, I quote, "The United States contends that the words white persons should be construed to mean Europeans or persons of European descent. This definition is ambiguous. Bayans is a European by birth and previous residence, yet the United States contends that his petition should be dismissed because he does not belong to the race which is European or white." End of quote. After a lengthy discussion of various meanings of race and European, of mixed races in Europe, and problematizing the very idea of European or white races, he continued, quote, "The United States contends further that there is an Asiatic or yellow race to which belong substantially all Asiatics, including these petitioners. No authority to support this theory is cited by reference to history, to ethnological theory, either ancient or modern, or to physical appearance. In their appearance, some or all of the petitioners would pass undistinguished in Western Europe. They are no darker than many Western Europeans and may resemble the Chinese in feature no more than they resemble the American aborigines." End of quote. Questioning both the concepts of European or white and Asiatic or yellow races, the judge moved on to discuss cases in which people of Asiatic origin, such as the quote-unquote Hebrews, had been considered as an exception in the American racial system and were admitted to citizenship. He then made several informed references to the history of Armenians to show how most of the time in their history the Armenians supported the Christian Europe, fought against, quote, the Persian fire worshippers and against the Mohammedans, unquote, to argue that they had been always closer to Europe than Asia. And I quote, "Their latest ruler of the French house of Lusignan maintained himself beyond 1350. Here is Adana, where Muradjan was born. HALLADJIAN was born in Syria not too far. No one of the petitioner was born in Armenia. Since their final overthrow, the Armenians have been oppressed by the Turks and have looked vainly to Europe for relief. They are dispersed through Asia Minor." End of quote. After making another lengthy discussion of the changes in the meanings of white in various U.S. statutes, acts, and classification systems, the judge concluded, I quote, "We find then that there is no European or white race, as the United States contends, and no Asiatic or yellow race, which includes substantially all the people of Asia. That the mixture of races in Western Asia for the last 25 centuries raises doubt if its individual inhabitants can be classified by race. That if the ordinary classification is nevertheless followed, Armenians have always been reckoned as Caucasians and white persons. That the outlook of their civilization has been towards Europe. We find further that the word white has generally been used in the federal and in the state statutes, in the publications of the United States, and its classification of its inhabitants to include all persons not otherwise classified. That the word white, as used in the statutes, publications, and classifications, though its meaning has been narrowed so as to exclude Chinese and Japanese in some instances, yet still includes Armenians. Congress may amend the statutes in this respect to provide more specifically what persons may be admitted to citizenship seems desirable. While the statutes are unchanged, this court will not deny citizenship by reason of their color to aliens who, like the Armenians, have hitherto been granted it. The petitioners will be admitted to citizenship. End of quote. Naturalized Armenians who had never thought of their racial belonging, thus had to become white in the American context, as some scholars would argue. To be more precise, I argue that alongside many other immigrants, these negotiations of race extended the meaning of whiteness to include Armenians and many other Asiatics, whom the American public in general would still consider as not being quite white. As the first generation of Armenian immigrants became naturalized American citizens, some committed to various American causes, such as the participation in the Spanish-American War or First World War. Some made vertical advancements up in the American social mobility ladder, becoming successful professionals, businessmen, or farmers. In places where they still lived in large concentrations, however, the private Armenian and public American spaces remained separated linguistically and culturally. Armenian institutional and discursive spaces emerging in this first phase of negotiations could afford being insular, inward-looking, and remain disengaged and disconnected from the larger American public spaces. Increasingly, however, the immigrant generation felt challenged in the American context as they confronted with the limits for negotiating linguistic and cultural differences. In order to preserve linguistic or cultural distinctiveness, whether within narrowly defined hometown neighborhoods or larger Armenian community, the immigrant generation had to establish educational institutions for younger generations, many of whom were American-born. Initial attempts to start Armenian language educational institutions eventually failed because of their inability to compete with the American public schools. The immigrant generation realized that in order to succeed in America, their children had to master the English language, and many, in fact, preferred American public schools for their children. But public schools, with their Americanizing mission and instruction exclusively in English, were important agencies of assimilation. To cite Robert Myrick, the most notable historian of early Armenian immigration to America, I quote, "Public schools and their teachers taught impressionable youngsters that the preservation of Armenian names and old world customs and ideas was both totally wrong and un-American," unquote. End of quote. The Americanization of the immigrants' children was not hard to achieve. But the challenge for the immigrants was how to connect them with the Armenian institutional or discursive spaces. Rabbi Isaac Meyer Weiss, whom I quoted in the beginning of my talk, who advocated for the Americanization of the Jews, had similar concerns when he mentioned that the Americanization could eventually lead to the disappearance of Judaism in Americanism. The second phase of negotiations, I argue, begins when, after establishing certain institutional and discursive spaces, the immigrant generation embarks on adjusting them to the social, political, and cultural milieu of the host country. It is in this second phase of negotiations that some of these spaces may decline and disappear, while others may become embedded in the social fabric of the host society and become more durable. At this stage, the designation host country is no longer productive as a category of analysis, because gradually some of these initial immigrant spaces become integral institutions of their new societies. In the final part of my talk, I'm going to briefly discuss some examples of such cultural crossings between Armenian and American spaces, and then conclude. The second phase of negotiations begins with the immigrant generation, when the immigrant generation is faced with the challenge of connecting their descendants, often offspring of mixed marriages, to the institutional and discursive spaces created by them. Among the Armenian immigrants, the second phase of negotiations begins in the 1930s. In 1931, Archbishop Vahe assumed the primacy of the Armenian diocese in America. By then, the headquarters of the church diocese had already moved from Worcester to New York, where the number of Armenians had significantly grown. Before his tenure in America, Archbishop Durian had served in Greece, Bulgaria, and Manchester, United Kingdom. He was fluent in English and immediately embarked on implementing some reforms in the Armenian Church of America. Among other innovations, he endorsed the publication of bilingual Armenian English prayer books and missals to be used in the Armenian Apostolic Churches in America. Many other Armenian organizations, such as the political parties, began publishing English-language periodicals and pamphlets in order to connect with Anglophone, American-born younger generations. The Ramkavar Party started the Armenian Mirror in 1932, and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation started the Hyrenic Weekly in 1934. For the same purpose, both also created youth chapters in the 1930s, in which English became the dominant, if not the only language of communication and correspondence. These attempts only partially solved the problems of connecting the American-born generations with Armenian spaces. But in the long run, families who stayed connected with churches or political organizations, newspapers that kept arriving to certain addresses, maintained the institutional and discursive spaces in the ongoing negotiations of Armenianness and Americanness within these increasingly hybrid and hyphenated spaces. I could go on and provide more examples of how the American-born second and subsequent generations continued negotiating their belonging in these Armenian-American spaces after the 1930s, how the Armenian-American institutional spaces eventually were divided along pro- and anti-Soviet sympathies, and how these opposing factions negotiated their conflicting allegiances and Americanness during Second World War and the Cold War, but I will have to leave it for some other talk. Let me make some final remarks about these hyphenated and hybrid forms and conclude. In a speech delivered in 1915, referring mostly to Irish and German Americans, former President Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed, I quote, "There is no such thing as a hyphenated American who is a good American. The only man who is a good American is a man who is an American and nothing else." End of quote. Just about a year earlier, Louis Brandeis, an American-born Jew and the leader of American Zionist organization, wrote, I quote, "My approach to Zionism was through Americanism. In time, practical experience and observation convinced me that Jews were, by reason of their traditions and their characters, peculiarly fitted for the attainment of American ideals. Gradually, it became clear to me that to be a good American, we must be better Jews. And to be better Jews, we must become Zionists." End of quote. Good and bad are relative categories, aren't they? Almost 2 years after this proclamation and 1 year after Theodore Roosevelt's announcement, Louis Brandeis was nominated by President Woodrow Wilson to serve as Associate Justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. Whether the Armenian policymakers and certain segments of the American public whether the American policymakers and certain segments of the American public accepted or rejected hyphenated Americans, many immigrant collectivities produced hyphenated or hybrid spaces and identities by negotiating their religious, racial, linguistic, and cultural identities in the American context. In the process of these never-ending negotiations, new forms of Americanness emerged, which I argue should be conceptualized beyond ethnicity. The designation ethnic American often may imply that the ethnic and American parts can easily be separated for analytical purposes. But these are hybrid identities and spaces, and it is impossible to draw a line of separation between the ethnic and American parts. Armenians from Lebanon, Armenia, arriving to America in the 70s through the 90s, could not see the Armenian American spaces and identities as ethnically Armenian, because these had been for decades fashioned as Anglophone and Americanized spaces. They were run and administered as American enterprises. From the American perspective, to the contrary, these have been ethnic Armenian spaces. Moving beyond the American-centered perspective, which scholars of transnational migration would call methodologically nationalist perspective, in my talk today, I suggested instead to theorize these spaces as hybrid forms emerging out of multifaceted negotiations of the immigrants and their descendants. In the process of these never-ending negotiations, they change and acquire new forms of expressions, responding to the events happening in their immediate neighborhoods, in the country at large, and often transnationally and globally. One of the many examples of this hybridity are the mixed language hymn books that I have encountered in many apostolic Armenian churches across America. Usually bilingual, Armenian and English, many of these books also include a section in mixed Armeno-Latin or Armeno-English, which is classical Armenian and Latin characters but adjusted to the American English pronunciation, which does not easily fall into Armenian or American categories. This is probably one of the most visible examples, but in less visible cases, it might be very tempting to generalize and present the Armenian American spaces as exclusively Armenian, unhyphenated ethnic spaces. It is still possible to argue that in some of these spaces, Armenianness or equally Americanness have been more or less expressed historically at different periods, but treating them as ethnic spaces would provide a distorted picture of the social reality and represent a methodological and nationalist perspective. To conclude, my intention today was to provide an alternative to theories of assimilation and ethnic resilience, and to complicate the conceptualization of hyphenated American forms as ethnic spaces. By historicizing the immigrant experiences, I argued that wherever the immigrants created compact communities, they collectively embarked on multifaceted negotiations of identities and belongings in America. I suggested further that the American Constitution and the First Amendment in particular provided the necessary prerequisites for the immigrant collectivities such as the Armenians in New England, New York, or California to establish a variety of societies, organizations, institutions, and periodicals in the first stage of negotiations. Once these what I call institutional and discursive spaces emerged, they were challenged to conform with the American culture and society and to become relevant for the American-born generations. In the second phase of negotiations, some of these organizations, such as many hometown societies, became irrelevant and declined. Others, like Armenian churches and political organizations, were able to adjust to the American context, in part by adopting English language and some other American practices. The negotiations, especially in the second phase, involved some redefining and reconceptualizing of old world identities and Americanness. If successful, these negotiations in the second phase made these institutional and discursive spaces embedded in the social structure of American society. In other words, these spaces became American not by assimilating, but by expanding the boundaries of Americanness and by adding to its diverse expressions. By discussing some examples of the complex negotiations of religion, religious, racial, cultural, and linguistic belongings in America, I further argued that the emergent hyphenated forms could be best understood and analyzed as hybrid or hyphenated spaces and identities beyond ethnic categorization and reductionism. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Okay. Make sure I have a pen. Right. All right. Okay.
Thank you for your fine presentation, Professor. I'm from the Boston area, so I have a two-part question.
Okay.
Now, I know that there were Armenians in East Cambridge, I think, and in the South End and Jamaica Plain. Why was Boston not the largest Armenian community in New England? Why Worcester, not Boston? That's one part. That's okay. my first question. The second part of my question is, what percentage of the Armenians who were converted to Protestantism, what percentage were they, and what percentage were they Congregationals? because
Okay.
because I feel that the Congregationalists in particular probably assimilated, probably learned English. They were taught English by their immigrant converters, and they had an advantage when they came to this country and assimilated more rapidly than other Armenians, including the Presbyterians.
Yeah. I want to start from the second question. So, the first Armenians who arrived in this country were predominantly Protestants because of the Protestant missionaries working in the Ottoman Empire. And they came to Worcester in particular because one of the Protestant missionaries that was in Harbert, who was in Harbert, was involved in the wire mill company in Worcester, and he brought several Armenians from Harbert to Worcester. So Armenians who were coming here by different networks, they were coming and really concentrating in this area because of work. Some knew that there was work, and they called their relatives, and they used their extended networks to make Worcester one of the first concentrations of Armenians. Boston became one of the most important centers about the early 20th century, I would say, because one of the most important Armenian political organizations founded its chapters and its headquarters in Boston, established in Boston area. It's in now it's in Watertown, the Heidnik building, but it used to be in Boston. Well, I guess I answered the first question. Now the second, unfortunately, we don't have percentages of even Armenians who came to America because the US censuses at the time were really complicated. They didn't know how to count populations. In some cases, they were counted as Turks because they were coming from the Ottoman Empire. In other cases, they would be counted as according to religion. And so there was no consistent way of counting immigrants, and that's why we don't have percentages. We don't even know what percentage of them were Protestants and what percentage were apostolics. And so similarly, we don't have any percentage of the converts who converted. It's almost impossible to study those who assimilated because there's no way of tracing how many Armenians came and how many assimilated. And the only way to say that these many remained Armenian is because we know that there were certain Armenian spaces, like churches. They had books in which they registered all their members. So we know that there were people who remained connected to these churches. But those who preferred converting to Protestantism, there's no way of counting them. So unfortunately, I cannot give you percentages and about what percentage converted to Protestantism or Congregationalism. But you're right that the Protestants were more more easily assimilated than the Apostolic Armenians because, in part, because when they adopted English, it was much easier to connect with the Protestant faith which they shared before coming to this country. So it was not much different for them. Thank you. Michael?
Thank you for that really interesting talk. Really interesting. Hello.
Yeah, there you go. Work.
Thank you for that really interesting talk. I was curious, since you were talking about negotiation as an action between two or more partners, if you could talk more about negotiations about Armenianness between Armenians in America, in addition to, so it's not just like Armenians and Americans.
Yeah.
I mostly ask just because, since people come from different villages,
Yeah.
and then they have to give up, or sometimes they choose not to, their dialects or the food that they eat, or sort of like spaces of difference within those spaces of difference that you're talking about. It seems like there's already an idea of hybridity in the idea of Armenians in America without even the American equation necessarily. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, sure. I, I think that thank you for this question. This is a great question. And I think I was engaging with this question in my last year's talk much more than today. Yeah. So, yeah, of course, Armenians coming from the Ottoman Empire were represented different were coming from different backgrounds, not only in terms of Protestant apostolic faiths, but also from these localities to which they remained connected, at least the first generation, for a very long time. It was in the second phase of negotiations, what I call, when they tried to adjust to American context and at the same time define what Armenians mean and the contours of Armenianness now that their homelands are destroyed, now that there is Soviet Armenia and there is no hope for any other Armenia. So basically, in American institutional and discursive spaces, there are two options. You either have to conceptualize your Armenianness through pro-Soviet orientation or through anti-Soviet orientation. Those are the two avenues at the time provided for the negotiation of Armenianness in American context. And some of these initially compatriotic, narrow hometown societies are involved in this kind of negotiations, and one of the slides that I showed last year was actually about this, about how compatriot union of Gurin began kind of promoting among the members the idea of supporting to Soviet Armenia as being one of the ways in which they could express Armenianness now that their homeland was destroyed. So this was one avenue through which the compatriotic, narrow compatriotic affiliations were channeled towards more Armenian, all Armenian initiatives. And one of the ways these compatriots could see this kind of Armenianness as related to their narrow hometown society's identities was through the construction projects that they were sponsoring later in Soviet Armenia, or some of them sponsored in Lebanon, where many of their compatriots had settled after the genocide. And so certainly these spaces provided not only space for negotiating Americanness and Armenianness, but also different versions of Armenianness. That's why, again, I want to emphasize that these are hybrid spaces, and we cannot even describe them as in singular terms. This is what it means to be Armenian American, because there are many ways of being Armenian American. And well, I want to show you a slide. I even wanted to include this slide to kind of visually show that the spaces, we should actually look at them as a spectrum between Armenianness and Americanness, and there are all kinds of variations in between. So in some spaces you will feel that this is a more Armenian space and there is nothing American, and in other places you will feel that there is nothing Armenian in this space. It's all about Americanness. So in this kind of spectrum, there is space for negotiating these different kinds of Armenianness as well. That's a concept that I have been struggled with a long time. I'm using that word without necessarily committing to it, but I couldn't find a better word. That's why I'm using hybrid still. So I'm still in the process of searching for a good word, for a better word. Spectrum.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Vahe, for this. It's a very interesting and timely project. And I did hear previously about how Armenians and other migrants, including Jews to the United States, and the way they had to argue how white they are. And that argument couldn't, I think it's very interesting given the current situation in the US. But I wanted to hear more about on which basis did the Armenians make the case that they are actually white, given the biological foundation of racial categories in the US, and to what extent, for example, an Armenian from so-called Asiatic Turkey versus an Armenian from the Caucasus would be categorized differently in the American legal system. The other thing that I wanted to ask you is to go from the legal level to the everyday level, because at one point when you were showing the picture of one of the Protestant Armenian churches, you made a distinction between that Armenians were here considered to be a racial group rather than an ethnic group. So what's the difference between the ethnic and the racial in that particular context? Thank you.
Again, I want to start from the second. The most helpful comment of distinguishing racial and ethnic was the one I heard at Albion College, and it stuck to me. So racial, when people tell you that what you are, that's what race is. And ethnic is what you tell you are. That's what ethnicity is. I mean, that's the basic definition. But I think Armenians, those who were excluded from Protestant church in Fresno, they couldn't find a reason but being an Armenian. But being an Armenian was just their appearance. The Protestant Americans didn't like them because they appeared different. They looked different. And they called them you're Armenian, and they would attach some other nasty words sometimes, like garlic Armenians, maybe sometimes worse. So that kind of stigma that was attached to people and had a negative connotation rather than these people really kind of identified with Armenianness. That's why I think that was more a racial than ethnic kind of designation at the time, Armenianness. And also considering that many of these people were more affiliated with these compatriotic hometown societies, and hometown identities were stronger expressed, and confessional identities were stronger expressed than Armenianness in this period. So all this leads to think about this as racial rather than ethnic category. And also in the American context, people are increasingly thought in terms of race, not ethnicity at this period. So that adds another layer why this is probably a racial thing rather than ethnic. And it is easy to appropriate because the first experience is that you're excluded from the church not because of the difference in which you practice Protestantism, but of the difference of the look, of how you look. You're not allowed to sit in the front rows because you look different. I think that's all about race. That's why I want to actually tell that story as a story about racial discrimination rather than ethnic segregation or ethnic discrimination. Regarding the first question about the basis on which Armenians claimed whiteness, unfortunately, this is the only case of Armenians. The only case of Armenians. For Armenians in the court of Massachusetts, there were 52 prerequisite cases in which this is the only Armenian case heard. So apparently the American court system was pretty easily convinced based after this case that Armenians should qualify all as white. So again, there is not a single basis. The judge referred to ethnographic theories, referred to racial theories, referred to common sense, saying that they don't look much different than Western Europeans, and referred to congressional intent, trying to explain what the meanings of white have been in the US acts and statutes and different decisions. So there is no single basis. And unfortunately, the number of Armenians who were coming from Caucasus to America was extremely low. I don't even know a single case. I assume there were, but I don't know of a single case. So most Armenians came from Central and Eastern Anatolia. And Central and Eastern,
I'll pass it on. You can't. You're right. Thank you again, Vahe. So I think for what was fascinating about your talk about the history of immigration to America using the Armenian case was, first of all, the issue and the myth, debunking the myth of church and state, which I think that's a very important aspect. I was just listening to a talk in American culture on the Hmong community who come in and how the church is so much involved, right? And so conversion becomes so much of an important aspect for assimilation because they're animists, right? But the case of the Armenians here and the Fresno church about bringing in Armenian Protestant, right, shows you that it's even a particular kind of, you're a Christian, you're a Protestant, it's a particular kind of Protestant that the already the institutionalized churches are enforcing. So I think that's a fantastic way to enter into that debate of church and state, and then problematizing then also the racial and this transformation in this first generation of passage, right, between race and ethnicity. Religion clearly has to be taken into consideration, right? And I think that even, you know, a lot of the racial kind of language, so putting into discourse Armenianness, which is fascinating how this process happened, is also putting into discourse race, right? And I think that there's a lot of code words there also around religion, right? And religious differentiation. So I thought that these were really two important contributions to the field of immigration studies in America. And I think that then, you know, what you say about then different generations to historicize this first generation, right? And how differently then does a second or third generation Armenian American come to embrace his or her identities along Dure project. So thank you. I don't know if you want to respond to that or.
Thank you. There's one interesting thing also to mention, that assimilation is not a linear process. Even those who were assimilated, the second, third generations, they found avenues to come back to these ethnic spaces to reconnect and become Armenian American in whatever sense. There are many ways of being Armenian American.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for showing me how this, like for all of us, but particularly me, interested in the migrations of Armenians, both within the Ottoman Empire and also outside the Ottoman Empire, showing the spatial dimension, also temporal dimension, because I never thought about what happened to those. I reckon it's Mytyunlar and other things that homeland associations in the 30s and 40s. My question is a kind of follow-up. Did the class play a role in this entire story, especially the first generation and between the first and second generation, between those guys who applied to the court versus very rich drug dealers in Boston who established themselves from the 1890s onwards? And I will ask you a more, I know you are tired, by the way, this is the fifth or sixth question, so you may want to answer this question later, but and I'm kind of playing into Michael's research that the historical experiences of Armenians as bandukts, as migrants, and as garibs, which is something from 15th century. Yeah. And in the second bandukutyon, the second migration or migranthood in the 19th century, are not very well known, but not very well studied. That's why we need Michael. Experiences, historical experiences. Did these things play a role in the construction of the identity, or was there also a kind of a inheritance of this historical experience within the generations? For instance, the Harput people were not only migrating to the US, but they were also, or earlier than they migrated to the US, they were migrating to different parts of the Ottoman Empire and were establishing different kind of networks. I was wondering whether you came across to references to these networks which they left in the old world and kind of build upon those experiences when they migrated. And I don't know whether you look at what I'm trying to say, whether you look at that part of the story. Thank you.
Yeah, those are both interesting. The second question again, compatriotic societies had literature. I produced some had periodicals, some had histories of their towns or cities. In those kind of resources, which I've studied mostly, you don't find any references to migrants, to what happens to migrants and where they are going, how they settle. They're very, very scarce. And I was particularly interested in learning more what happens to them when they come to America. They don't want to talk about it. Or their entire concern is their town or village. This is all they are talking about. So I haven't come across anything that contains any kind of hints to existing networks outside these localities where they're coming from. So, yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much to say about that too. But class, yes, indeed, certainly class played an important role. But many of the Armenians who were coming to this country were not upper classes, of course. Some of the first who came were through Protestant missionaries, and they could also, later they kind of, when they could earn some money, they sponsored their relatives and friends. Some became successful by hard work, by becoming American or assimilating, and later coming into Armenian American spaces. That's how I know that they became successful initially, by changing their names. By the way, Robert Myrick's father was one of these Armenians who was really very successful in the Boston area, but he, as soon as he arrived to this country, changed his name. He abandoned his Armenian last name, first name. He became Americanized in terms of his name. He learned English. He quickly was involved in business, but his son returned to this American space, American-Armenian space, and reconnected with this kind of heritage. That's another challenge. That's why I couldn't tell more about class, because I don't see much difference in terms of class among Armenians who are coming into this country. But in this time, referring to Jewish examples, for example, among the Jews represented many different classes, and the German Jews who were coming to this country much earlier than the Eastern European Jews, they lived in Upper Manhattan. They would not connect with the Eastern European Jews who were settled in Lower Manhattan. But there was an incident in the 1910s when a very wealthy Jewish businessman comes to a Hotel Saratoga, it's somewhere in New York State, and he's refused accommodation because he's Jewish. So the prevailing at the time anti-Semitism, anti-immigrantism, everything, was affecting everyone regardless of class. So the upper classes had better chances to negotiate because they had connections. Of course, it is almost in the same period that this guy, who is the leader of the American Zionist organization, becomes a member of the US Supreme Court, right, because of his connections. But others like Seligman, this Jewish wealthy person, still suffers the consequences of anti-Semitism. So again, even based on class, it's hard to make any generalization that will distinguish the upper class experience from not so wealthy immigrant experiences. Thank you.
You mentioned briefly that Armenian immigrants from Lebanon and Armenia in the 70s, 80s, and 90s found many of these organizations to be foreign, in a sense, the Armenian American organizations. Now that we're 20 to 40 years into the immigrant experience of those Armenians, what parts of your analysis apply to more recent Armenian immigrants, and what parts do you think are different if you were to take the same approach to more recent immigrants?
Well, that's a really good question. I could give another talk about the modern experience of immigrants. America has changed after 1965 and the 70s in general. So it's became more ethnically tolerant country, more mindful of the diversity of the country, and so now the immigrants are in much better situation than the immigrants of the end of 19th, early 20th centuries were. So in that sense, Armenians who came from Lebanon and Armenia were in more privileged situation to establish their organizations, to expand the organizations established by Armenian Americans, and to make them more durable compared to what they could achieve back in the beginning of the 20th century. Let me show you another slide. I'm prepared. This church is the diocese of the Armenian Church in California. All the stones came from Armenia. All the stones. About, I don't know, $3 million was spent on the construction. So this resembles very much an Armenian space. You don't see anything American in the space. Even if you enter, everything is in Armenian. Everybody speaks fluently in Armenian. You can hardly encounter any person in this church who doesn't speak Armenian. So California became this heaven for the immigrants from Lebanon and Armenia to recreate their communities in this new setting. And even recently, California adopted a law in which public schools can teach Armenian as an elective. So the children of the immigrants can learn Armenian in their public schools. Again, comparing to the mission of the public schools back in the beginning of the 20th century, it's a radical difference. The American state does not try to Americanize or assimilate anyone. So now it's become more tolerant to newer forms of Americanness, and the negotiations will continue. I don't know where this will go. This may remain Armenian for ages because there are much more possibilities now to keep them insular and segregated from American spaces.
I have one more question.
Sure, go ahead.
And this is not in reference to immigration.
Yes.
The idea of greater Armenia.
Yes.
That realistically, I don't think the Armenians realize that they're ever going to have a greater Armenia, unlike the Kurds. Could you explain to me why? So, unlike the Kurds want a greater Kurdistan.
The shorter version of that answer would be the Kurds live on that territory. Armenians do not live in that territory for about a century now.
Okay.
Very
Good.
briefly.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.